Bonjour guys, welcome to the channel. So this video here is a video that I did on my main channel on July 20th of 2022. So about 2.5 years ago. This is back when I had dreadlocks. But anyways, since I have a new French channel, I'm going to take all my French videos and bring them over here. So here's a throwback video from 2.5 years ago. Why is a third of France almost empty? Hope you enjoy it. Real Life Lore is the original channel. Links to the original video will be in the description section down there.
France is one of Europe's and one of the world's most significant countries. Home to 68 million people, France is the third most populous nation in Europe, while the French economy is the 7th largest in the world, nearly identical in size to India, a country with 20 times the population.
Well, I didn't know you guys were doing so good over there in France, so good job, guys. Doing good.
The French language and French culture are widely known throughout the world, while the French military is the 8th best funded in the world, with bases all across the planet. France is a major global great power and has
something else I didn't know. Actually, I didn't realize they had bases all over the place like that.
Been for centuries now, which is why it's so surprising that nearly a third of the country here is basically just an empty void. And partially because of that, France has been diminishing in influence for centuries and continues to do so. For decades, people have famously identified metropolitan France in Europe as looking like a hexagon, which is
So I wonder, so if that part's almost empty, is there two different kinds of French, like this kind of France and this kind of France, kind of like split off, like the Belgium thing, where they're two different kind of people in the same country, or like, I don't know.
Is why the country is so often referred to as simply l'Hexagone. And due to this unique shape, it's incredibly easy to look at France through the lens of geometry when discussing regions, statistics, demography, and history. For instance, if you take a map of France and you draw a diagonal line from the port city of Le Havre on the English Channel over to straight through the center of Marseille on the Mediterranean, you'll cut the country roughly in half, and yet 60% of the French live to the east of this line, while only 40% live to the west of it. A fact that can be seen significantly more clearly when you switch out the map for a population density map. But what's far more interesting than that line are these lines. In between them is a stretch of France nearly 1,000 kilometers long and about 400 kilometers wide on average.
Yeah, but look, there's still population there. Clearly, you can see dense areas of population.
Nearly 1/3 of France's entire territory that's about the same size as Belarus. Within this large zone, the population density of people is only about 30 persons per square kilometer, about the same as the US state of West Virginia, which has led to French demographers referring to the area as France's empty diagonal. And while in reality, that's hardly empty, compared with the rest of France and Europe, it is a strange anomaly. Throughout the entirety of France on average, the population density is more like 120 people per square kilometer, 4 times more than the density of people living within the diagonal. To give even more perspective, neighboring Germany has a population density of 232 per square kilometer, while England has more like 270, and is therefore 9 times as densely populated as France's diagonal. France is politically divided between 18 regions that are further split up into departments and then into communes, somewhat similar to how America divides itself into states and counties. The least populated department in France is Lozère, with just a total of 76,000 inhabitants for all its nearly 5,200 square kilometers. That is comparable in size to the state of Palestine, which is home to more than 5 million people, while the entire population of Lozère could all fit comfortably into Wembley Stadium in London, with 24,000 seats left over to spare. And of course, Lozère is directly in the center of the empty diagonal, the most sparsely populated region of France, where Lozère is hardly an exception. All of these departments running through the center of France are substantially less populated than those on either side of it to the west and the east. So
what is the deal with that, guys? We're going to find out. This is very interesting. I didn't even know anything about that. I came across this video. I'm like, man, seems pretty interesting. That's something I want to know. Why is a third of France almost empty? Like, it's a good question.
What's been causing this anomaly in the core of one of Europe's largest countries to be happening? Well, for one thing, it's a bit important to understand some of the prior demographic history of France, which I promise is actually fascinating. The French philosopher Auguste Comte once said that demography is destiny, and for centuries, France's demography guaranteed much of the nation's successes and influence. For most of history, France was by far the most populous country on the European continent. During the medieval period, more than 1 out of every 4 people in Europe were French, and even by the 17th century, it was still 1 out of every 5. During the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, France was still the most populous nation in Europe.
I did not know that. I know I have a lot of French ancestry on my my grandma on my dad's sides, you know, on that side of the family. But yeah, very interesting.
And they had a higher population than even the entirety of Russia, and nearly double the population of the United Kingdom. In fact, at the time of Napoleon, France was the 4th most populous country in the entire world, lagging only behind China, India, and Japan. Such a huge population compared with all of her neighbors helps to explain France's dominance in European affairs throughout the medieval, Renaissance, and early industrial periods. But beginning in the 19th century, this demographic dominance over all of her neighbors began to shift away dramatically. The birth rate in France began to diminish in the late 18th century, far before they began to do so in every other European country, and then, during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, nearly 2 million French citizens were killed, which led to France's low population growth throughout the rest of the 19th century. For many years in France across the 1800s, the number of deaths in the country exceeded the number of births. And then, during the First World War, France lost 10% of its entire active male population in just 4 years. 1.3 million French were
10%. That's crazy. Of its entire population. Holy moly.
In just 4 years. 1.3 million French were killed during the war, and along with even more births being forgone by millions of potential fathers being away at war, the French population dropped by more than 3 million. And of course, the areas that were hit the hardest by this population drop was the rural French countryside, because at the same time that these trends were happening, France was also rapidly urbanizing, and the population was becoming highly centralized around just a few key population centers: Marseille, Lyon, Lille, and most importantly of all, Paris, the ever-growing city. Beginning in the 17th century, Paris began to grow larger and larger as hundreds of thousands of peasants from the French countryside continuously moved there in search of better opportunities. At the beginning of the 20th century, 40% of the French population were still living in the rural countryside. But over decades of intense societal pressures coming from millions of deaths from war, millions of men being away at war, decreasing fertility rates, and ever-increasing rates of urbanization, just 85 years later in 1985, that rate of French residing in the countryside had plummeted down to only 8%. And by then, nearly 1 out of every 5 French were living in just the Paris metropolitan area alone. But while urbanization and war certainly—
Wow, so 1 out of 5. So 1/5 of the population was just living in France. That's crazy. Or in Paris. Of course they were living in France. They were living in Paris, guys. That's what I meant to say.
Paris metropolitan area alone. But while urbanization and war certainly had massive effects on the population of the French countryside, not all areas were affected evenly. The mountainous areas of the French Alps, for example, while technically having a slightly dipping population, have a thriving tourism industry. And the majority of the French wine country, while also very rural, also continues to have a thriving industry and tourism appeal that has kept the areas decently well populated.
French Alps. Now I'm assuming that's down here, right? Because this would be the Alps coming through here, right? Switzerland's over this way somewhere. Maybe it's this one. I don't know which one it is, but I got a geography. But yeah. So I'm assuming, because you got Austrian Alps, Swiss Alps, you know.
But there are larger geographic issues at play here as well that help to explain the lack of people in the empty diagonal. When looking back at the map, you'll see that the empty diagonal spans one landlocked end of France by its border with Belgium to another landlocked end by its border with Spain. And while
I was wondering about that earlier. I see, because it goes all the way right here, all the way through to Spain. So I didn't know if that was like part of it like was troops marching through, from Spain through France onto the rest of Europe, and it was just something going on, killing people in the way or something. I don't know.
To another landlocked end by its border with Spain. And while not every coastal area in France is highly populated, it makes sense that many of them would be, as 40% of the entire global human population lives within just 100 kilometers of a coastline. So, by drawing these lines across the French interior, you're essentially drawing a line from one area that would be statistically less populated to another area that would also be statistically less populated. In fact, if you ignore international borders entirely, the empty diagonal's population trend continues and even expands its width across the Pyrenees into Spain, a country dealing with its own demographic issues in the form of low birth rates. But there's still more to it than just not being near the coast. The areas that the diagonal cover are largely agricultural land, and throughout the world, as agriculture has become more automated and industrialized, less workers in the industry are needed. In fact, 40 years ago, about 1.6 million people in France worked in agriculture, whereas now it's roughly only 400,000,
Wow, that's a huge difference.
or 4 times less people. Fewer jobs and fewer opportunities to make a living inevitably mean that people eventually move on. And regardless of the country, low population density itself can become a sort of self-repeating feedback loop as well. Areas with lower population often have minimal commercial activity, and as the already small population ages, there's nothing keeping the younger generations in the area. So they leave, not just for work, but also for all the amenities that other, more thriving areas can bring. And while the French government has expressed concerns over the issue and even funded research into how to fix it, there remains no real answer. While France's geography makes this issue seem relatively unique to France, it really isn't. Demographic shifts from the countryside to the cities is a global phenomenon.
Yeah,
and so too is the fact that more people generally tend to live closer to the coastlines, where there's just more economic activity. Therefore, it shouldn't really be too surprising after all that, wow, people actually do be living in cities. Now, if you want to start analyzing your own worldwide geographic and demographic trends, you're going to need a pretty solid grasp on things like geometry and statistics. But just like you might be, I've generally always been pretty
So I think that was the end of it, guys. The rest of that's just his sponsored bit. So why a third of France is almost empty? Very interesting. And I guess, like he's saying, it does go hand in hand with most, everybody's moving to the city because there's more stuff to do. Nobody wants to be stuck in the middle of nowhere. So anyways, comment down below, hit like, hit subscribe. Have a super fun, awesome day. I'll catch you in the next one. All right, take care.